Welcome to the Backlog, a podcast hosted by ADAPTOVATE. I'm Kayla Cartwright, a senior consultant on our Los Angeles team. ADAPTOVATE partners with clients to accelerate outcomes by implementing new transformative ways of working. We are a global firm with offices in the US, Canada, Singapore, Europe, and Australia. Our guest today is Veronica Millen, an advocate and consultant on diversity and inclusion. Veronica has worked for over 25 years as an HR professional, with over 18 years focused primarily on diversity and inclusion, what we will call a D&I, in both corporate and consulting roles at top global and Australian corporations. She is an accredited member of the International Coach Federation and is passionate about making an impact on organizations and individuals alike. Welcome, Veronica.
Hi, Kayla. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thank you for being here today. We're so happy to catch up and talk shop, since I know you and I are both passionate advocates for diversity and inclusion and equity. So I'd love, even though I sort of already know, I think our listeners would find it really interesting to hear what drew you to D&I. And again, we may use that acronym throughout, and it just stands for diversity and inclusion. So now you know that, listeners. But what drew you to this work?
So I think we've done some work together before on International Women's Day, and we're both really passionate about D&I. So I'm really excited to be talking to you. And as we've shared before in our personal conversations and work conversations, we've both had our own journeys, I suppose, and that's what informs our passion for D&I, and I'm sure it's similar for a lot of listeners. So for me personally, my mum's South American. I know we've got that tie with Uruguay, and my dad's Dutch, so I grew up in a very multicultural household. So that, was started my interest in this area. My sister's got black hair and olive skin. I've got fairer skin and fairer hair, and she was treated very differently at school to me. In Australia, often people talk about wogs, sometimes endearingly and sometimes as a bit of a racial slur, and she was often called a wog, which is, a term that often is used in Australia for people of Greek or Italian descent, and often people assumed based on her looks that was her culture and ethnicity, whereas I wasn't. So that sparked my interest initially. Also, my mum's a doctor and my dad's an engineer. So for the circles that I grew up in, it was unusual to have both parents working full time, and so there was a very unusual division of labour in my house, or more even, should I say, distribution of labour in terms of household chores. So that sparked my interest in terms of female rights and equal rights. As I said, my mum's a doctor, and she would also often get envelopes that were addressed to Doctor and Mrs., and she would always talk to us about the unconscious bias around that. And then a few years ago, I broke my ankle, so I wasn't as mobile for a period of time, and that really got me to see what it's like for people with a physical disability, whether it's permanent or short term. So on a lot of levels, my journey's informed my passion for D&I, specifically for me around ethnicity and equal rights in gender terms, and also from a disability point of view. And I know you've had an interesting journey too, Kayla.
Yes, growing up where I did, and then working in low-income communities, mostly Black and Latino students, I've been a student of, racial and ethnic disparities, and really learning about how to be a good advocate in both nonprofit and public sector. And it's been an interesting journey, and one that never ends, like constant learning.
Exactly.
And I know, we are recording this. It's the 23rd of April or 24th in Australia. I'm over on the East Coast in the US, so it's still the 23rd here. And I know for us, we are in, I think, week 6 of quarantine or lockdown during coronavirus. So I've been thinking a ton about how COVID and the pandemic and many people under quarantine globally, how that's impacting diversity and inclusion in both positive and negative ways. And I'm curious, what do you think are some of the good things that might be coming out in terms of like diversity and inclusion from COVID or coronavirus?
Yes, it's so topical at the moment, isn't it? So interesting, such an unprecedented time. And I've been reflecting on that too in terms of how the current pandemic and, most of us are in lockdown and isolation and social distancing, how that's impacting D&I. And I think it's impacting in both positive and negative ways. So to answer your question, in terms of the positives that I'm seeing a lot more people working from home. And so obviously, that can be a really good thing for a lot of people, not for everybody, but for a lot of people that can be a positive. Roles that previously people have said couldn't be done from home now have been evidenced that they can be done from home. So, a lot more flexibility for workers and to be able to work flexibly and work from home. So hopefully that's one of the positives that may continue post the virus.
Definitely. And I know maybe you've seen this. It seems like I see, our reporters on the news reporting from their homes. I see my managers like with or our team members with their kids and their pets in the background and being much more authentic and vulnerable because we have, we're all going through this together. We're all in our home. We can't really hide it. So just so much more authenticity and vulnerability, which is interesting because often women are praised. Like people sometimes call that, especially the vulnerability piece, like a women's strength. So it's interesting now to see it, be leveraged by all genders and B, come out and be capitalized upon, even though we've always sort of had it. You know what I mean?
I agree. So many more, what I'm hearing here in Australia is a lot more males. And even with the international companies I work on and do Zoom calls with and so on, a lot more of the males appreciating the juggling when you're working from home and the kids and the pets in the background and people being a lot more. So, it is good to see and hopefully that continues post the pandemic.
Yeah, and I know at least, from my perspective, I'm saving a lot of time or what might be called the time tax in that except when I'm on calls, video calls with clients externally, our team, we're pretty authentic. So I don't need to get as gussied up as I might. And I'm saving, a lot of time as a woman not having to do that. And that's been a pro. And I know you mentioned last time we talked, we were talking about people who live far from their workplaces because of, either cost or, family reasons, what have you, like they're saving so much time not having to commute. And
exactly the same commute. And often that can be, as you say, lifestyle reasons, or it can be financial reasons. So, in a lot of geographies, the places that are further away from the CBD are less expensive. So for those in lower socioeconomic groups, it could be a real saving in time. But as you say, often for females, there's that time tax and saving that time on, the hair and the makeup and so on. Is a saving as well. So really interesting times and hopefully some positives coming out of it.
And what about some drawbacks, do you think? Like what are some negative ways that this is impacting this lockdown and is impacting issues of inclusion?
Good point. And as I said, I think there are positives and negatives, and sadly there are negatives as well as the positives we just talked about. So, I think it's interesting to note initially with the negatives that the virus itself discriminates. It can discriminate against those who have low immunity. It can discriminate against those with certain types of physical or mental health issues. So that's interesting. When I headed up diversity and inclusion for a large international retailer, we had a program that was specifically focused on employing people with a disability. And we did that for ethical reasons. But we also did that for financial reasons in terms of business benefits. There's a lot of research that shows that when someone's abilities are well matched to the position, people with a disability can be more productive and have lower rates of turnover. But for those people with a disability, the virus can really discriminate. the virus, I suppose, can also discriminate against those on the front line, those who are more exposed to the general public. So people who are working in, whether it's health or in the supermarkets, those people will be more exposed to the virus just by the nature of their work. It's interesting. Some commentators have talked about the fact that being able to isolate is really a luxury. So those in lower socioeconomic groups, and in some countries, being able to isolate or to wash your hands or to sterilise things is a luxury that some, third world countries don't have. So that's, interesting. And look, in Australia, we've really seen an increase in the calls to domestic violence hotlines and to mental health hotlines. I don't know if you're seeing that in the US as well, but that's obviously really concerning and sad. Is that something you've seen over there?
Yeah, we've seen it, and it's interesting. Some states we see it, and then some communities we actually see a dip, and at the same time we see a dip in calls to like child hotlines because teachers aren't necessarily observing and reporting. So, if you can't get away, it's hard to make the call. So, but we know it's happening, and it's scary. And everything you're saying about being on the front line, at least in the United States, disproportionately Black and Latino populations are in frontline roles. Women are also in a majority of frontline roles. And everything you're saying is so true. Like the ability, I'm fortunate, you and I are fortunate, probably many people listening to this are fortunate to be able to even work from home. But I have family members who they're lucky, to still have a job. That's a whole other gamut, but they're still going and, are nervous because they come home to their families. And there's just a variety of, systemic historical context in the U.S. And I'm sure each country has their own context that's affecting everything,
Yeah. And that's such a good point you raise, and it really does emphasize some of those systemic issues where some people are losing their jobs and they can be in certain groups that have historically had, discrimination or less access to certain things. So, that is of a concern to me, that certain groups are more likely to lose their jobs and the discrimination there, the systemic discrimination, I suppose, and issues. And even for those who do keep their jobs, some people don't want to show their homes. They have Zoom calls and they, for whatever personal reasons, they may not want to share their personal life. And as you say, sometimes when we see a dip in calls, some areas we've seen increase in calls here in Australia and others we've seen dips. And as you say, it's really concerning because those people are not able to access the help they need because they can't get away from the issue at home to make the call secretly. So that's a concern as well. And I know one lady I came across recently, she didn't have broadband internet. She had what's called dial-up in Australia. I'm not sure if it's the same in the US, but for personal financial reasons, she couldn't afford that type of internet, and she didn't want everyone at work to know. And then it became very evident because the work had assumed that she would have access to the more access to the internet, and it kept dropping out. And for her, that was a very personal thing that she didn't want to share in the workplace. So for a lot of us, working from home it can be great, and for others it's really not an optimal thing at all. So like a lot of things in life, there's pros and cons, I suppose, of what's happening.
Yeah, totally. That makes me think just, it's a privilege in general to be able to work from home when you can, but it also privileges those in a certain class or those with certain comforts. And I also think about folks with children at home. Well, I'm sure it's a blessing. I can't even imagine having children and having to juggle that even more so with being at home. And that's an interesting thing. And you mentioned mental health challenges or hotlines. And as someone who likes to be a big advocate for mental health awareness and mental hygiene, it's been interesting. I've been thinking about the pros and the cons that this moment in time actually affords. I think because we have so much more remote flexibility for folks who can work from home, like that's actually often given as an accommodation in, we'll say, white collar corporate settings for folks with mental health diagnoses or disabilities. So in some way, like this makes it more the norm and allows a lot of flexibility. So it's good. And at the same time, like if this isolation could exacerbate diagnosed, cases or exacerbate the number who maybe aren't diagnosed and need to. And I know in Australia, there's a big campaign that exists, I think year round, called Are You Okay? Some of my colleagues from the team have shared, and I think it's a great, and they're really doubling down on it. And I would encourage everyone to check on your strong friend, even because you never know, how this is impacting them. And I think it's so important to think about how our peers, how everyone we work with, we just need to suspend judgment and stop and think about what's like, I might have a perception about what's going on in their world, but I don't really know, and don't really know like how all the dimensions of their identity play into this.
Yeah, it's such a good point. I think with all things D&I, it's as much as possible, it's challenging as humans, but as much as possible where we can suspend our judgment and suspend our assumptions and just check in with people. I think that's a really good point you raise.
Yeah. And so how do you think workplaces and society might become more or less inclusive as a result of COVID-19?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think whilst there's a lot of research that shows that diversity and inclusion in the workplace is good for the bottom line, in my experience, it's often the first thing to go when budgets are cut. So I think it'll be interesting to see if specific D&I programs are cut as companies, do have revenue issues during and financial issues during COVID. I saw a really interesting article on LinkedIn yesterday that talked about if companies cut back their D&I as a result of financial issues during coronavirus, then they really didn't get it in the first place. So it referenced how
I need you to send that my way after.
I'll share it as a link, I'm sure, as part of the podcast. But what was really clever is it talked about, the benefits of D&I have been proven in relation to increased innovation. So, when you have cognitive diversity, when you have a whole range of different people and they feel safe to be themselves and bring them whole selves to work, you can really increase your innovation. And that's where a lot of the benefits come from D&I, is different ways of thinking and innovation. And so encouraging that during these times is really important, because companies need to be innovative in their response to COVID. They may need to pivot and think of innovative new ways of serving clients and so on. So to cut your D&I programs might be cutting off your nose to spite your face, I suppose, is a saying, because you really need that innovative, different points of view and cognitive diversity to help solve some of the issues that COVID have brought up. So that will be really fascinating to see who's genuinely committed and keeps going with these things and who needs to cut back for financial reasons.
Yeah, that's really, I look forward to reading that, because I hadn't even made that connection into. What else are you thinking?
Sadly, I think we'll see an increase in racism. I hope that's not the case, but I'm keeping an eye on that. I think, because of the pandemic, people are often really scared. And when we're scared, it doesn't always bring out the best in us. I know President Trump has called it the China virus at times, which, perhaps is not helpful. I know the Australian Human Rights Commission, I'm trying to be diplomatic, I know the Human Rights Commission in Australia has said that a third of the race complaints in the last few months have been directly related to COVID-19. And I know in New York, the New York State Attorney General launched a hotline that allowed New Yorkers to report hate crimes, harassment, discrimination, and that was a direct response to reports of a rise in anti-Asian harassment due to COVID-19. So I'm concerned that perhaps there will be an increase in anti-Asian sentiment. I don't know if that's something you're seeing. I know, we talked about the New York State Attorney General, but I'm not sure if that's something you're witnessing anecdotally.
No, it totally is. And it's interesting. I actually follow a lot of diversity and inclusion accounts and, HuffPost's Black and Black Lives Matter and if HuffPost Women, Forbes Women. And I've been seeing a lot of media encouraging people my age, Asian millennials, reminding their peers and their younger family members to reach out to their older family members and say, when you leave the house, you need to be prepared. This may happen, and call me anytime. And that I just saw that for the first time yesterday, and that was eye opening. To be able to do that, and what I understand about the culture is there's strong family ties and reverence for the elders. So that's a tough position to be in. And I can't the xenophobia is definitely something we need to guard against as much as possible. And I can't even imagine being in that group at this moment, what that must feel like.
I saw someone talking the other day on the news here and talking about how, Asian Australians are scared too. They're just, they're scared about getting coronavirus too. And so they're just as scared as, of us going through the same thing. But then on top of that, they've got the, potentially the racism on top of that. So, that's a very difficult position. As I say, I can't imagine. The other thing other thing I'm interested in is I saw some experts talking about, the different approaches to handling a pandemic. And one of them was, herd immunity, and that, a certain percentage of the population need to have immunity. And then, scientifically through herd immunity that people may be able to go back to more less restrictions and less isolation. And one expert was talking about letting young, and they didn't define what young was, so young in inverted commas, I don't know they would define as young, but allowing young, in inverted commas, people return to work first, because perhaps from a physical point of view, they may be less, at risk of serious health implications if they do get the virus. And I wondered whether that would potentially reinforce any conscious or unconscious age bias. I know there's a lot of talk about potential age discrimination in the workplace, and particularly in terms of recruitment. And I was concerned that if that approach was taken in some communities in terms of allowing younger people back to work first, whether they would be seen as stronger or more productive or workers, and whether that would, as I said, reinforce, potential conscious and unconscious age bias. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Kayla.
No, I definitely think that could be the case. And you already see, at least in the US, our population pyramid, we've got all the boomers are the ones who are in that older pool right now. And there's definitely more cases of that. So I'm sure something would come, and it's interesting. And something a little different I've been thinking about that might result. So the good thing, of course, hopefully more organizations will be adaptive and take on flex and remote work and working from home, even post this. At the same time, I've just heard from friends and even about, we did a webinar. One of our Australia colleagues ran it for different audiences. And one of the poll questions was, what's the hardest thing about working from home? And the top ranking one was the lack of boundaries between home and work life. And I've heard instances where, definitely not in our organization, but where senior managers and other organizations have said, oh, well, you don't have anything to do anymore at night or weekends. So of course you can keep working. And I hope that that stops now. And I definitely hope that doesn't continue if we allow for that. So that's something I'm thinking. And you mentioned
really interesting.
Yeah. And
we get so excited with D&I. We both want to talk.
I know. You go, please.
And it comes back a bit to that mental health piece that we talked about before as well, in terms of, therefore making it challenging, as for everybody, and especially those who are prone to mental health issues. If you're expected to work 24/7 and you can't get out and get exercise or fresh air, which are so important. Everybody's mental health. So I think, that's a really interesting point you raise. I hadn't thought of that, but it's so true in terms of the boundaries between work and home, and just being expected to continue to work and not do anything else. But I'm interested also what you were going to say.
Well, and I was going to say, on the flip side of that, one of my hopes, and I think you alluded to this, was that since typically all partners are at home now, there hopefully will be a more balanced distribution of what I call, and what experts call, emotional labor, that often is carried by one partner over the other, typically a woman in a male-female relationship. So I'm hoping that folks who aren't normally bearing the burden of organizing everything for children or the household or logistics will recognize all that needs to be done and handled in someone's brain, and that will be balanced, more distributed, so that the person, typically a woman in many societies, is doing maybe 1.5 jobs instead of 2 jobs, is one of my hopes.
Visibility of that mental load. Absolutely. Increased visibility of the mental load and the household chores. Absolutely. I hope that is a positive that comes out of all of this.
Yeah. Well, let's actually switch gears a little bit, if that's okay, and stop talking about Corona, since we have all had enough, I'm sure. But given, that ADAPTOVATE, our organization, focuses on helping organizations deliver value through agile and other new ways of working. And I know you have some experience working in agile business environments. So I'm curious, since you're an expert in both D&I and agile, how do you think agile ways of working actually lead to more inclusion?
So, look, I think whilst it's very kind of you, I don't know if I'd consider myself an expert in agile, but thank you. But I certainly have worked in agile workplaces, and I love the work that ADAPTOVATE does in that space as well. I think we're quite well aligned in terms of the philosophy around agile, and because there's so many different ways of adopting that, I suppose. But so I think agile teams tend to value, in my experience anyway, tend to value the individual and the interactions. So I think, that really supports inclusion. And I think agile teams tend to value collaboration and cross-functional teams. And I think that's really important as well. So, it might be worthwhile now. I might just some listeners will know this and others may not. So it might be worth just distinguishing, when I talk about D&I or diversity and inclusion, I know you and I both love a quote by Werner Myers, which is around, diversity is around being asked to the ball, and inclusion is being, asked to dance. And I think that's an important distinction because, if you've got good, unbiased or as unbiased as possible recruitment and selection processes, you should have a whole range of people that come and work for you of different identity factors. But the important thing, and where you get the business benefits, is where they feel included, they feel psychologically safe, they feel comfortable to bring their unique viewpoint, and therefore you can get the cognitive diversity that I mentioned earlier and the different ways of looking at things. So I think agile can be a really good way of driving inclusion, and as we know, that's the most important thing from a business benefit point of view when you're looking at D&I. So I think things like a well-run stand-up, for example, where each member can talk about their work regardless of how senior they are, and they don't have to be the loudest person in the room, that can really drive that inclusion. And we know that inclusion is so important in terms of, as I said, the business benefits from D&I. So, a really well-run stand-up, as I said, can really drive inclusion. And also, in my experience, a well-run stand-up can also, anybody can help when removing a blockage. So it's not just your traditional the leadership team go away and try and solve a problem for the team. It's the whole team, and anyone at any level and any any level of experience and seniority can assist with removing a blockage. So I think that's something that Agile can really bring to inclusion. The other thing I thought about was retros, and how retros really encourage reflection. So, we can reflect on how inclusive we've been, how inclusive the experience may have been for others. We can ask others how included they feel. The research shows that when we're in the majority group, we often don't even realise, with no misintent, we just don't realise that the minority group may feel a certain way. So, being able to have those open conversations and reflect on, have I been inclusive? How inclusive have I been? Have I felt included? Can I check in with others? I think, the retros are a really good opportunity to drive inclusion. And I know you made a really good point when we spoke a couple of weeks ago around both of our thoughts in this space. You had a really good point about the dot voting.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. When I first, came into the Agile world, I loved the mechanism of having everyone write their thoughts so that you're having, for a retrospective or story mapping or any brainstorming session, because then everyone's heard, and then the dot voting is very democratic and it's a liberating structure. And that, everyone's say is equal when you go and vote on what ideas you want to talk about. And to me, that, it doesn't privilege sort of, like you said, the highest paid person or the loudest person in the room. And I know some other things that I think are really great that allow Agile to be really inclusive are just having the set cadence of ceremonies or events. Allows people who do, have to balance maybe work and kids, especially in this environment, to plan and focus on outcomes rather than like being on the clock at times when it's actually less conducive. Or maybe from a cognitive lens, maybe they work best, maybe they're night owls and they get to do their best work at night. And as long as, they're at the ceremonies, that's what matters, is that focus on outcomes. And I also really love that people get to leverage their strengths and by doing what they're passionate about and by choosing the type of tasks rather than being told to do different tasks. And that goes beyond inclusion, but I think that's just the strength. And now you make me want to go add a bias question and an inclusion question to our team's next retrospective.
Yeah, good.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, good. And I think, that's a really good point you raised that I hadn't thought about so much before. But, I know that when I've done unconscious bias training before, some of the leaders have reflected and said, I think, in an unconscious bias sense, I've given the same people in the team the opportunities in terms of the better projects and the development projects and so on, because I go to the same people all the time. And as you said, one of the good things that can come out of Agile from an inclusion point of view is not just picking the same people every time, not just the leader picking their favourites, even if it's subconsciously. So, I think that's a really good point you raised. It's really interesting.
Yeah, well, thank you. So as we sort of begin to wrap up, I'm thinking about this notion actually of implicit biases, and I'm sort of curious what advice you might have, not final words of wisdom, but I know you and I have spoken about the Harvard implicit bias test as a tool that we might suggest all listeners take. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and any other similar frameworks?
Yeah, absolutely. So I love the Harvard Implicit Association. I suppose it's a test, so to speak. I know it's something you and I have done in the past, and having this conversation has made me want to go back and revisit that and see where things are at. So, it's interesting the way our brains work is there's millions of pieces of data coming in at any one time, and our brains can only process so much. So our brain then just puts things into certain categories and assumptions to cope with the amount of data that's coming in. And we know in these technological times that as technology increases, often there's more and more information coming. So it's, unconscious bias is normal. It's natural. Everybody has it just because of the way our brains work. And it's not always bad. Sometimes the assumptions are fine. We see something and we assume it's a pen. We don't have to pick it up and write with it. And, our brain takes a shortcut, and that's okay. But sometimes what shortcuts we take are not helpful and don't have the best decision making. So, we see someone and we make an assumption based on the way they look, and that may not be correct in terms of inclusion in the workplace. And so it's really interesting to become more aware of what our unconscious biases are, because, as I said, everybody has them, you have them as well. And so Harvard have a free online test. It's called the implicit association test, and it's really measuring unconscious bias. And people can go online and Google that. And I highly recommend it. I quite enjoy doing it, actually. And the results, and because it's quite an unusual test, an unusual way of doing things. But I really enjoy it, as I said, but it's really useful to become more aware of our unconscious biases, because we all have them. And by becoming more aware of them, we can then question, is that a useful bias that I have? And is that helping me make the best decision that I can make for myself and for the business? So I'd recommend that listeners go online, if they haven't already, and Google Harvard Implicit Association and have a look at those tests.
Mm-hmm. And I know I've taken them, and I keep meaning to go back. And it'd be interesting even to look at and take I think there's 30 or some odd different, based on different dimensions of identity. So you can see, do you have a natural inclination or bias, for males versus females? So now after this conversation, I want to go take the one about Asian Americans or Asian population and see, like, have I actually now have some what's my implicit thinking, and then think about what action I can take as an individual and as a leader and a role model to guard against destructive, potentially biased, unintentional behaviors that might make a less inclusive environment. That's got me thinking. Yeah.
I'm going to do the same, and hopefully some of our listeners do.
And have you ever heard of, we haven't spoken about this yet, have you ever heard of something called the privilege walk or the identity walk?
I have, yes. I was talking about that last week, actually. There's a really good clip on that, absolutely. And we often do that in our unconscious bias sessions, and it's so fascinating. It's such a great... so maybe do you want to describe it for listeners, for those who haven't heard of it before? Because I think it is, I love it. Yeah, it's a great one.
Absolutely. I first learned about it when I was a teacher at a national nonprofit. And actually then I was training other teachers in diversity and inclusion and thinking along, working across lines of difference. And basically it's an exercise where everyone lines up in a horizontal line, and then a facilitator reads 30 some odd statements, and you take steps forward or back based on whether you've lived them in your life. And I know some of the statements that were most eye-opening for me, especially as a white woman, even though I had lived in diverse communities, were things like, I can go to the store and find Band-Aids in my skin color. Or I see people that look like me on TV, or I have dolls that look like me, or I grew up, with books in my house or not, or like your example about the dial-up. That's an example that might show up in various contexts. I'm sure, thinking about the Aboriginal populations in Australia, like there's probably some questions that would align with that, I would imagine, in Australia, right?
Yeah.
So
it's really interesting to see then people's reaction of where they land up. And I know when I did it for the first time, seeing where I was and seeing where other people was, I had a feeling of guilt, others had feelings of shame, and none of us should have had those, necessarily needed to have those feelings, but it's really, really interesting. And one that really stood out for me when I did the privilege walk was, as a participant, was around, I can go in public and show romantic feelings if I'd like to, and for some people who identify as LGBTIQ+, that hasn't always been the case. And so, that was a real eye-opener for me that I just took for granted and hadn't even thought about, that if I wanted to hold hands with someone, a partner, I could in the street and not feel fear or shame or scared or whatever the particular feelings are. So, but the privilege walk is a great exercise. And as I said, there's a really good YouTube clip that we might be able to link for people to see who haven't experienced it or seen much about it. I think that's a great one.
Yeah. And something else I've been thinking since you and I last spoke is just something, more action those who are interested can take is thinking about being a good ally. And I try to be a good ally to different groups by learning. And so that I'm not placing the burden on people in minority groups to educate my peers or people who might be in a majority group. Rather, I'm trying to take some of that burden off the shoulders by being educated or sharing resources like the ones you and I are speaking now, so that we're not always, asking someone to carry an even bigger burden by teaching us about a culture or a subgroup. So that's something I'm thinking.
Yeah,
allyship.
That's right, because some people don't want that burden, and equally others, may want to have a voice and may want to talk about these things. But a lot of people, but also, as you say, a lot of people don't want to have to explain it, and do really appreciate if people take the time to understand and educate themselves. So I think that's a really good point. And as you say, there's so many great resources out there, as you say, being a member of all of those groups, whether it's in LinkedIn or HuffPost or any of those, there's so many different groups where we can get more education because, we laughed about the Agile expert, but even the D&I expert, to me, it's and we talked about this at the beginning of our conversation, it's a lifelong journey. It's not something where you go, right, I'm an expert, I know this now, there's always so much more to learn, and everyone, we talked about our unique journeys at the beginning, and everybody has their own unique journey, and learning about their journey and how that's informed their particular situation, and as you say, the different factors of identity. So, I think it's great that ongoing education is really important.
Totally. Well, and that leads us to our last question and a half. So do you have any final words of wisdom to share with individuals and organizations on their journey to be inclusive?
I think it's what we've just been talking about. I think it's a great segue. I think it's just that ongoing knowledge, and trying to educate ourselves continually. So for me, the things I try and remember and my, potential words of wisdoms would be three key things: knowledge, commitment and courage, building our knowledge, continually learning, as you say, being an ally and educating ourselves. As we know, in the majority, we often don't understand how the minority feels. So in some instances, we might be in a minority group, but in others, we may be in a majority. So building our knowledge, having that commitment to continually support others and building our knowledge, and then having the courage. Sometimes it can be challenging. D&I can be fraught. We can be scared of saying the wrong thing. And I think as long as it's said with respect, I think it's important that we have the courage to speak up for ourselves and for others and for minority groups, and have the courage to continue to learn and the commitment to try and drive a more inclusive workplace and a more inclusive society. So, knowledge, commitment and courage for me.
Definitely. Well, it has been an absolute pleasure to chat with you and to chat and learn from you. And one more final question we like to ask all of our guests. You have a podcast recommendation for our listeners?
Oh, yes, I love podcasts. For me, one of the ones that I often listen to and really enjoy is Potential Psychology. So Potential Psychology is a podcast run by a psychologist called Ellen Jackson, and it was actually a finalist in the 2019 Australian Podcast Awards. And Ellen, as I said, is a psychologist. I actually studied with her at university for our undergraduates, and she really focuses on using science to help people thrive and flourish. So it's a really enjoyable podcast. She interviews a lot of experts, and it's really interesting in terms of how we can use the science of positive psychology to thrive and flourish. So if you haven't listened to that, you might enjoy that one.
I might. Well, awesome. Excellent. Thank you so very much. Mil gracias, Veronica. And thank you, listeners of The Backlog, for tuning in. And Veronica, I wish you a wonderful weekend. And everyone else, stay tuned for our next episode. Thank you. Ciao.